If you've ever listened to Marshall Arisman's stories about the absurdities and anomalies in his life and work, then you must have heard him say at the end of a thought, "Does that make sense?" This verbal tick, in an otherwise warm yet authoritative speaking style, is not really a question, but an assertion. Of course his stories, even the most nonsensical, make sense. And for his listeners, including thousands of illustration students who have passed through Arisman's classrooms over the past 50 years, his tales are not just entertaining, but existentially instructive. While there are many good reasons for inducting Marshall Arisman into the Society of Illustrators Hall of Fame, his life as a storyteller in word and image is the glue that holds all his varied accomplishments together. A serial storyteller, Arisman believes that stories are found everywhere, in all forms and expressed in many ways, especially visual. Illustration as visual essay, the School of Visual Arts MFA program he founded 30 years ago, was his visionary idea to emphasize word and picture storytelling beyond children's books and comics, and has resulted in scores of published books and even more successful artists. This incubator for story making was not conceived in an academic vacuum. Arisman is a pioneer of conceptual and narrative illustration. His hauntingly expressive work is a commingling of elements of realism and abstraction, symbolism and mysticism, cut with a sly sense of wit. And behind each of his pictures is a story. Arisman appeared on the illustration scene in the late 1960s with a self-published collection of stinging satiric commentaries on gun violence, a theme inspired by his brother's extreme fascination with firearms when Americans were, like today, standing firm on their Second Amendment right to keep them. The critical mass of these satires earned Arisman a sinecure at the New York Times op-ed page during its formative years, where he was cast as the go-to guy for virtually any article laced with violence, later branching out into war crimes and other despicable acts. He did not like being typecast, but someone had to do the job, and so he did. A cognitive dissonance exists between the person who is as mild-mannered as anyone who sees auras can be, and he does see auras, and the artist whose work is usually anything but tranquil. When Arisman began doing editorial illustration, it was more akin to the heyday of expressionist and surreal graphic work emerging from Western and Eastern Europe in the 1960s and 70s than the representational painting and drawing then so popular in American magazines. His early inspirations were illustrator André Francois and later Francis Bacon. As Arisman developed confidence, his work became more raw. Born in Jamestown, New York, Arisman is a homegrown original whose approach to illustration has never been conventional or fashionable. The job description of illustrator is not how he self-identifies. Illustration is just one part of a toolkit that includes gallery painting, sculpture, video, printing, and Lord knows what else he's hidden away. Some of his work is topical, while his most passionate artistic obsessions have gone from guns to monkeys, from tribal masks to Elvis. His career took a crooked path from the outset. He attended Pratt Institute to become a graphic designer. After graduation, he worked in Detroit for General Motors, designing the logo for Delco batteries. 3 months later, he realized that he hated working with people and solving other people's problems. That drove him into illustration. His intent at that point was not to manage a freelance business, but to explore himself through art. He was 25. I was window shopping for a direction that reflected me. I found not one direction, but many, he said. Arisman spent 2 years painting, drawing, and sculpting monkeys. Not your run-of-the-mill monkeys, but sacred monkeys, which inhabited both his illustration and gallery art. Saturated in monkeydom, he explains. He turned his passion from the visual to the literary with a coming-of-age story about a boy named Marshall, who was born with a twin brother that was a monkey. Initially, the 2010 novel, The Divine Elvis, was only in written form. Then he added over 100 illustrations. The story was inspired by his family. I have a brother 2 years older than me who's from another planet. My mother was a twin with 6 sets of twins in her family. My grandmother on my father's side was a noted psychic and spiritualist minister. My mother's parents were Pentecostal holy rollers. I knew enough family secrets that I could betray in writing now that my parents are dead. Prior to the Divine Elvis, Arisman taught himself motion and sound in a project called Cobalt Blue, a DVD of current paintings with a custom composed soundtrack over which he narrated tales about the work. There is so much pretentious art speak out there, I thought it might be refreshing to simply track the stories that surround the art. He also produced a newspaper, brief encounters with some very fine artists, that combined his and other artists' work in poking fun at the art world in the Dada and Fluxus tradition. I was born in upstate New York in a town surrounded by trailers, he explains. Knowing how much my neighbors enjoyed reading the National Enquirer, I thought a newspaper about the art world might fill in their cultural gaps. It cost $700 to print 1,000 newspapers. I got my money's worth from the responses from the art world who felt the paper was not high art. Arisman does not define himself as low or high, but he's still wandering and looking for the right space and place. In a recent conversation, he quipped, "What I do is always surprising, but never mainstream." He added, "I'm a bad barometer for what will sell or what is appealing to my fellow man." Does that make sense?